Rita Hayworth hung in Andy's cell until 1955, if I remember right. Then it was Marilyn Monroe. That picture from the 7-Year Itch where she's standing over a subway grating and the warm air's flipping her skirt up. Marilyn lasted until 1960. She was considerably tattered around the edges when Andy replaced her with Jane Mansfield. Jane was, you should pardon the expression, a bust. After only a year or so, she was replaced with an English actress. Might have been Hazel Court, but I'm not sure. In 1996, that one came down, and Raquel Welch went up for a record-breaking 6-year engagement in Andy's cell. The last poster to hang there was a pretty country rock singer whose name was Linda Ronstadt. I asked him once what the posters meant to him, and he gave me a peculiar, surprised sort of look. "Why, they mean the same thing to me as they do to most cons, I guess," he said. "Freedom. You look at those pretty women, and you feel like you could almost, not quite, but almost step right through and be beside them, be free. I guess that's why I always liked Raquel Welch the best. It wasn't just her, it was the beach she was standing on. It looked like she was down in Mexico somewhere. Someplace quiet, where a man would be able to hear himself think. Didn't you ever feel that way about a picture, Red? That you could almost step right through it?" I said I'd never really thought of it that way. "Maybe someday you'll see what I mean," he said, and he was right. Years later, I saw exactly what he meant, and when I did, the first thing I thought of was Norma Didden, and about how he'd said it was always cold in Andy's cell. A terrible thing happened to Andy in late March or early April of 1963. I have told you that he had something that most of the other prisoners, myself included, seemed to lack. Call it a sense of equanimity, or a feeling of inner peace, maybe even a constant and unwavering faith that someday the long nightmare would end. Whatever you want to call it, Andy Dufresne always seemed to have his act together. There was none of that sullen desperation about him that seems to afflict most lifers after a while. You could never smell hopelessness on him. Until that late winter of '63. We had another warden by then, a man named Samuel Norton. The Mathers, Cotton and Increase, would have felt right at home with Sam Norton. So far as I know, no one had ever seen him so much as crack a smile. He had a 30-year pin from the Baptist Advent Church of Elliott. His major innovation as the head of our happy family was to make sure that each incoming prisoner had a New Testament. He had a small plaque on his desk, gold letters inlaid in teakwood, which said, "Christ is my Savior." A sampler on the wall made by his wife read, "His judgment cometh, and that right early." This later sentiment cut zero ice with most of us. We felt that the judgment had already occurred, and we would be willing to testify with the best of them that the rock would not hide us, nor the dead tree give us shelter. He had a Bible quote for every occasion, did Mr. Sam Norton, and whenever you meet a man like that, my best advice to you would be to grin big and cover up your balls with both hands. There were less infirmary cases than the days of Greg Stamus, and so far as I know, the moonlight burials ceased altogether, but this is not to say that Norton was not a believer in punishment. Solitary was always well populated. Men lost their teeth not from beatings, but from bread and water diets. It began to be called grain and drain, as in, "I'm on the Sam Norton grain and drain train, boys." The man was the foulest hypocrite that I ever saw in a high position. The rackets I told you about earlier continued to flourish, but Sam Norton added his own new wrinkles. Andy knew about them all, and because we had gotten to be pretty good friends by that time, he let me in on some of them. When Andy talked about them, an expression of amused, disgusted wonder would come over his face, as if he were telling me about some ugly, predatory species of bug that was, by its very ugliness and greed, somehow more comic than terrible. It was Warden Norton who instituted the Inside Out program you may have read about some 16 or 17 years back. It was even written up in Newsweek. In the press, it sounded like a real advance in practical corrections and rehabilitation. There were prisoners out cutting pulpwood, prisoners repairing bridges and causeways, prisoners constructing potato cellars. Norton called it Inside Out and was invited to explain it to damn near every Rotary and Kiwanis club in New England, especially after he got his picture in Newsweek. The prisoners called it road ganging, but So far as I know, none of them were ever invited to express their views to the Kiwanians or the Loyal Order of Moose. Norton was right in there on every operation, 30-year church pin and all. From cutting pulp to digging storm drains to laying new culverts under state highways, there was Norton skimming off the top. There were 100 ways to do it, men, materials, you name it. But he had it coming another way as well. The construction businesses in the area were deathly afraid of Norton's Inside Out program because prison labor is slave labor and you can't compete with that. So Sam Norton, he of the testaments and the 30-year church pin, was passed a good many thick envelopes under the table during his 16-year tenure at Shawshank's warden. And when an envelope was passed, he would either overbid the project, not bid at all, or claim that all his inside-outers were committed elsewhere. It has always been something of a wonder to me that Norton was never found in the trunk of a Thunderbird parked off a highway somewhere down in Massachusetts with his hands tied behind his back and half a dozen bullets in his head. Anyway, as the old Barrel House song says, my God, how the money rolled in. Norton must have subscribed to the old Puritan notion that the best way to figure out which folks God favors is by checking their bank accounts. Andy Dufresne was his right hand in all of this, his silent partner. The prison library was Andy's hostage to fortune. Norton knew it, and Norton used it. Andy told me that one of Norton's favorite aphorisms was one hand washes the other, so Andy gave good advice and made useful suggestions. I can't say for sure that he hand-tooled Norton's Inside Out program, but I'm damn sure he processed the money for the Jesus Soughton son of a whore. He gave good advice, made useful suggestions, the money got spread around, and son of a bitch, the library would get a new set of automotive repair manuals, a fresh set of Grolier encyclopedias, books on how to prepare for the Scholastic Achievements Test, and of course, more Earl Stanley Gardners and more Louis L'Amours. And I'm convinced that what happened because Norton just didn't want to lose his good right hand. I'll go further. It happened because he was scared of what might happen, what Andy might say against him if Andy ever got clear of Shawshank State Prison. I got the story a chunk here and a chunk there over a space of about 7 years, some of it from Andy, but not at all. He never wanted to talk about that part of his life, and I don't blame him. I got parts of it from maybe half a dozen different sources. I've said once that prisoners are nothing but slaves, but they have that slave habit of looking dumb and keeping their ears open. I got it backwards and forwards and in the middle, but I'll give it to you from point A to point Z, and maybe you'll understand why the man spent about 10 months in a bleak, depressed daze. See, I don't think he knew the truth until 1963, 15 years after he came into this sweet little hellhole. Until he met Tommy Williams, I don't think he knew how bad it could get. Tommy Williams joined our happy little Shawshank family in November of 1962. Tommy thought of himself as a native of Massachusetts, but he wasn't proud. In his 27 years, he'd done time all over New England. He was a professional thief, and as you may have guessed, my own feeling was that he should have picked another profession. He was a married man, and his wife came to visit each and every week. She had an idea that things might go better with Tommy, and consequently better with their 30-year-old son and herself, if he got his high school degree. She talked him into it, and so Tommy Williams started visiting the library on a regular basis. For Andy, this was an old routine by then. He saw that Tommy got a series of high school equivalency tests. Tommy would brush up on the subjects he had passed in high school, there weren't many, and then take the test. Andy also saw that he was enrolled in a number of correspondence courses covering the subjects he had failed in school or just missed by dropping out. He probably wasn't the best student Andy ever took over the jumps, and I don't know if he ever did get his high school diploma, but that forms no part of my story. The important thing was that he came to like Andy Dufresne very much, as most people did after a while. On a couple of occasions, he asked Andy, "What a smart guy like you is doing in the joint?" A question which is the rough equivalent of that one that goes, "What's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?" But Andy wasn't the type to tell him. He would only smile and turn the conversation into some other channel. Quite normally, Tommy asked someone else, and when he finally got the story, I guess he also got the shock of his young life. The person he asked was his partner on the laundry steam ironer and folder. The inmates call this device the mangler because that's exactly what it will do if you aren't paying attention and get your bad self caught in it. His partner was Charlie Lathrop, who had been in for about 12 years on a murder charge. He was more than glad to reheat the details of the Dufresne murder trial for Tommy. It broke the monotony of pulling freshly pressed bed sheets out of the machine and tucking them into the baskets. He was just getting to the jury waiting until after lunch to bring in their guilty verdict when the trouble whistle went off and the mangle grated to a stop. They had been feeding in freshly washed sheets from the Elliott nursing home at the far end. These were spat out dry and neatly pressed at Tommy's and Charlie's end at the rate of one every 5 seconds. Their job was to grab them, fold them, and slap them into the cart, which had already been lined with clean brown paper. But Tommy Williams was just standing there, staring at Charlie Lathrop, his mouth unhinged all the way to his chest. He was standing in a drift of sheets that had come through clean, which were now sopping up all the wet muck on the floor, and in the laundry wet wash there's plenty of muck. So the head bull that day, Homer Jessup, comes rushing over, bellowing his head off and on the prod for trouble. Tommy took no notice of him. He spoke to Charlie as if old Homer, who had busted more heads than he could probably count, hadn't been there. "What did you say that golf pro's name was?" "Quentin," Charlie answered back, all confused and upset by now. He later said that the kid was as white as a truce flag. "Glen Quentin, I think. Something like that, anyway. Here now. Homer Jessup roared, his neck as red as a rooster's comb. "Get them sheets in the cold water. Get quick, by Jesus, you—" "Glen Quentin, oh my God," Tommy Williams said. And that was all he got to say, because Homer Jessup, the least peaceable of men, brought his billy down behind his ear. Tommy hit the floor so hard he broke off 3 of his front teeth. When he woke up, he was in solitary and confined to same for a week, riding a boxcar on Sam Norton's famous grain and drain train, plus a black mark on his report card. That was in early February of 1963, and Tommy Williams went around to 6 or 7 other long-timers after he got out of solitary and got pretty much the same story. I know, 'cause I was one of them. But when I asked him why he wanted it, he just clammed up. Then one day he went to the library and spilled one hell of a big budget on information to Andy Dufresne. And for the first and last time, at least since he approached me about the Rita Hayworth poster like a kid buying his first pack of Trojans, Andy lost his cool. Only this time, he blew it entirely. I saw him later that day, and he looked like a man who has stepped on the business end of a rake and given himself a good one whap between the eyes. His hands were trembling, and when I spoke to him, he didn't answer. Before that afternoon was out, he had caught up with Billy Hanlon, who was the head screw, and set up an appointment with Warden Norton for the following day. He told me later that he didn't sleep a wink all the night. He just listened to a cold winter wind howling outside, watched the searchlights go round and round, putting long moving shadows on the cement walls of the cage he had called home since Harry Truman was president, and tried to think it all out. He said it was as if Tommy had produced a key which fit a cage in the back of his mind, a cage like his own cell. Only instead of holding a man, that cage held a tiger, and that tiger's name was Hope. Williams had produced the key that unlocked the cage, and the tiger was out, willy-nilly to roam his brain. 4 years before, Tommy Williams had been arrested in Rhode Island driving a stolen car that was full of stolen merchandise. Tommy turned in his accomplice, the DA played ball, and he got a lighter sentence, 2 to 4 with time served. 11 months after beginning his term, his old cellmate got a ticket out, and Tommy got a new one, a man named Elwood Bloch. Bloch had been busted for burglary with a weapon and was serving 6 to 12.